Hi, I'm Ed Culberson, and I'm going to be your host on a tour which we'll take down Destiny Road. This is a story about the Pan American Highway, which, as most people understand, extends down through Latin America. But there's much more to the Pan Am than just that. For example, if you were to go to the library trying to find a book about the Pan American Highway, you'll find that they just aren't there because no one has ever written a comprehensive story about the highway. But there are some surprising things about the road that you should consider. A lot of people might say, well, I've never been on the Pan Am, we'll never go along that route. But guess what? If you've ever been riding on any of the U.S. interstate system, that road is part of the Pan Am Highway network. Also, if you'd had the opportunity to go up the Alaska Highway to our 49th state, you're riding along the northernmost segment of the Pan American Highway. The history of the road dates back over 400 years. It was King Charles V of Spain, the Holy Roman Emperor, who originally came up with an idea of a road network to connect the areas of the Western Hemisphere that were coming under the control of the conquistadores. King Charles knew that he needed land routes to take the fabulous treasures that he had pillaged from the Indians to get them back to the sea routes, back to the old world. When the Spaniards were in control, they did a lot of good work in terms of developing routes. This bridge, over 400 years old in Guatemala, is still in active service today. After Simon Bolivar rid the Western Hemisphere of the Spanish rulers, he also pressed the idea of a land route to connect the two republics. But unfortunately, the technology of the time simply wouldn't support that kind of a project. Really, it wasn't until the late 18th or 19th century and early 20th century that land transportation in the form of railroads took off. But the problem with railroads in Latin America is that they all run in the wrong direction. They don't go from country to country, but rather from the resource centers of each country down to the nearest seaport. It wasn't until the mid-1920s that the Pan American Union, which is the forerunner of today's Organization of American States, came up with the idea of a road that would connect all of the capitals of the republics of the Western Hemisphere. For the next 10 years, the planning went on, and finally, in the mid-30s, the actual construction of the Pan Am began. Since then, the project has moved very, very slowly, but today it has reached that goal that was originally created back in the 1920s. When the U.S. interstate system was included in the mid-1960s, it meant that the Pan American Highway system itself now became the world's largest, longest road network. What is the Pan Am like today? Well, most of it is two-lane asphalt road, rural, carrying a great variety of highway users, as you see here in Costa Rica. In some cases, the road shows much more refinement. Here in Peru, for example, it's a toll road. But if you happen to be a pedestrian or a motorcyclist, and you can get through that gap between the railing and the sign that says Motos y Peatones, you don't have to pay a toll. In Brazil, along the coastal route, their roads there are the equivalent of our interstate roads back here in the United States and carry about the same volume of traffic. One of the objectives in developing the highway system was to stimulate tourism throughout the Americas, and that the Pan American Highway has done. Right now you can get into any kind of vehicle and travel from the United States all the way down as far as Panama in comfort and in safety. Now that hasn't always been so, because the Pan American Highway is such a vital route that in the insurgencies that have occurred, like here in El Salvador, the road has become a favorite target for the battles. One curious aspect about the Pan American Highway is the fact that the original intent was to connect all of the capitals of the Western Hemisphere by road. Guess which capital wasn't a part of that route until the interstate system was included back in the mid-60s. Yes, Washington, D.C. was never on the main route of the Pan Am as originally conceived. There's another oddity about the highway. For example, a lot of people consider that it is like the Panama Canal. It was built and paid for by the United States. But that's not entirely true. Even though the U.S. has put about $1 billion over the years into the project, most of it has been for things like this, bridges in Central America. But the roads in between these bridges was the responsibility of each of the host countries. And in almost all of South America, as well as Mexico and El Salvador, all of the work was done at the expense of those countries, and the U.S. did not contribute. There's another thing about the Pan Am that I've noticed over the years, that it has never been a path to glory for any of the builders or planners or contractors. This monument in Brazil is the only place that I've ever seen where the builders of the Pan Am have been recognized. One thing about the Pan American Highway that I consider the most critical in these times: the Pan Am, even though it's alleged to be the world's most extensive highway system, is still not complete. There is a gap in the main highway between eastern Panama and northern Colombia called the Darien Gap. It's 87 miles long, and in this stretch there are no roads whatsoever. You cannot get into your car or on your motorcycle and ride through Panama on into South America by way of the Pan Am. And it's this gap in the highway that we'll be focusing on for the rest of this presentation. I'd like to give you a personal note here and explain to you how come I became involved in this Pan American Highway idea. I was born and raised in Washington, D.C. and went to high school there, and my 10th grade geography teacher, Miss Hanf, gave me a term paper assignment to write about the Pan American Highway, and that was the beginning of my fascination for the road. But it wasn't until 20 years later that I had the opportunity to actually get out there and ride the road. I was in the Army then, and in 1971 was transferred from Florida to Panama, and so with my two older daughters, we got into our decrepit Volkswagen and took off down through Mexico, Central America, and reached Panama. During the 4 years I was stationed there, I got into motorcycling, and throughout that time I toured all around Panama, Central America. I kept thinking, wouldn't it be great if I could get on my motorcycle, cross over the Panama Canal, and head on down the Pan American Highway in South America. But that's the kind of a dream that doesn't come true very often or very soon. And it wasn't until I got out of the Army and in 1978 read a magazine article about a Canadian motorcyclist who had driven his motorcycle all the way down to the tip of South America. The fascinating part about this article was that John Pitt was 64 years old when he did it. And I figured, well, if he can do that, I can too. So I went out and bought a new motorcycle, another BMW R80/7, and I left my new home in Florida and rode that motorcycle all the way down to the tip of South America. I got on the road down through Argentina and Chile and finally wound up in Tierra del Fuego and ended that part of the trip in Ushuaia, which is called the southernmost city in the world. It was a delightful trip, and once I reached the end of the road down at Cape Horn, it was simply a matter of going back home and finishing the trip. And here is the scorecard for that trip after I completed it. There was only one thing wrong about that most memorable trip, and that is, on the way south, when I got to Panama, I had to put my motorcycle on board this ship and have it sent to South America to avoid that Darien Gap break in the highway. On the way back, I had to fly the motorcycle and me from Brazil. That made me mad, and I figured that sooner or later somebody is going to take a motorcycle and get it through the Darien Gap. And I figured, why shouldn't it be me? So I went out and I bought a new style BMW motorcycle, one built for that kind of travel, and I went back to Panama, out to the end of the highway where the road stopped, to see what it would be like to get me and the motorcycle through. Well, I found out from that reconnaissance that it was going to be a very tough job. So I came back home and I wrote several stories about what I intended to do, asking for help, support, participation. I got hundreds of responses, but the one I was looking for came from a man called Danny Liska, who I had remembered as being the BMW advertising symbol of the 1960s. Danny was an around-the-world traveler himself and was experienced with the Darien. Danny now lives in Bogota and is married to a very influential woman by the name of Regina. And they, being quite familiar with the Darien Gap situation, told me that the man I really needed to contact was in Panama right then, preparing for a Jeep expedition through the Darien. So I contacted this man, whose name is Loren Lee Upton. He's a Californian and has made 5 attempts at getting through the Darien Gap with his Jeep in the course of going around the world by the transverse route. Upton was in Panama at the time, and I called him and he invited me to come down and join him on his 1986 expedition, which I did. Loren is the man in the red shirt. The young man with the white hat is his nephew, Lawrence Upton, and the woman in between is Pat Mercier, who at that time was the head of the Girl Scout movement in Panama. Between the 3 of them and the Jeep and me and my Amigo motorcycle, we constituted the Darien Gap expedition of 1986. After some weeks of preparation, we took off out to the end of the highway in Panama, and there we enlisted the help of a missionary to hire a crew of Indians to help us through the jungle. Once we made our preparations, we moved across the Chukunaki River by way of a platform on 2 dugout canoes that Loren very skillfully constructed. Once he got the Jeep across, he came back for me, and it was easy for us with Amigo to get across the river. But as soon as we got on the other side and into the jungle, things got rough. You've got to understand that in the Darien, you have the world's heaviest rainfall during 10 months of the year. and at that time you get these heavy trees falling down and blocking whatever trails may be there. So Lauren would have to get the Indians out with their machetes, chop their way through these trees so he and the Jeep could get through. Another major obstacle were the ravines that are cut in the jungle by the torrential rains. In this case, Lauren would winch the Jeep down into the ravine and then winch it out the other side, towing me and Amigo on behind. There were some cases where I could take off on my own out in front of the Jeep, but it really wasn't very productive because I'd either take the wrong trail or else I'd come to an obstacle and would have to wait until the main body caught up. What it meant was the loss of a lot of time, and it got even worse when Lauren began having trouble with his Jeep. We were trying to negotiate a very steep-sided river valley when the oil seal on the Jeep disintegrated, and we were stuck in this valley for 5 days while Lauren made repairs. We tried to winch the Jeep up out of the other bank. The oil seal broke again, and we had to resort to hand winching the Jeep up the bank. One day, we spent a total of 10 hours hand winching and moved the Jeep no more than 70 feet up the side of the river. But we finally got onto more level ground and made it into the next Indian village of Balsal. Here you see the chief of this village, and that concrete sidewalk is a story in itself, how it got there. But I took the chief for a ride up and down the sidewalk on my motorcycle, and then I noticed that the chief had a young daughter, a teenager, who had never seen a motorcycle before. I asked the chief if she would like a ride, and he asked her. She said yes, so we took off down the sidewalk. Naturally, having not ridden a motorcycle before, she was very apprehensive and clung to me very tightly, and you can bet she made quite an impression on me. But the fun stopped when we had the next river to cross. In this case, the Indians built a log raft, and we were able to get both the Jeep and the motorcycle across in one pass. On the other side of the Tuwira River, the going got even worse. We were moving so slowly that I finally broke away from Lauren and the Jeep and hired a small crew of Indians myself and went on to the next Indian village of Pukro. And there I had to wait 2 days while Lauren and his group finally caught up. When we reached this Kuna Indian village, Lauren and I both knew that we were in trouble. We'd gotten to within 15 miles of the Colombian border, but we were running out of time. The dry season was almost over, and we knew that the terrain on the Colombia side was even worse, and that we would never be able to make it through before the rains hit. So I made my decision. I put the motorcycle on board one of these dugout canoes and headed back downriver and home. In 12 hours in this canoe, we covered the same distance that it had taken us 33 days to go by land. Lauren stayed in that same Indian village, swearing that he was going to remain there through the rainy season and push on. When I got home, I wrote up my experiences and gathered resources because I was going to go back, determined to get through the gap again. BMW outfitted the bike with a larger tank and some other gear, and the following February, I rode back to Panama, went back to that same Indian village, and there I hired my own crew of Indians and took off following the trail that Lauren Upton had cut 2 months earlier. I never caught up with Lauren because as soon as I got to the Columbia side, I found out the terrain was terrible and Lauren had taken a different route, but I had to press ahead and go through a park that was established right there on the border. I ran into other problems because the Indians one time put the motorcycle on board a log raft, and sure enough, we hit some rough water. Amigo fell off the raft and was totally submerged in the river. So I had a non-running bike in the middle of some very rough terrain, but things got even worse. I got to the next village and was arrested by a Colombian policeman for bringing a motor vehicle into the park. He gave me a hard time, but I thought that I could get out of it because I had with me a letter. It's called a don't shoot him letter. And I showed it to this policeman, and he said the letter was not worth. Well, he suggested I use it for toilet paper because this letter was a letter requesting the courtesy of the Colombian authorities, but was signed by Panama's General Noriega. I finally had to pay this policeman $50 and give him my wristwatch in order for him to let me go. I moved on down to the Atrato River. I luckily got the bike running again, crossed over the river, and got back on the Pan American Highway heading for Bogota. The road on the other side of the river was bad, and it was a very long, arduous, very dangerous journey before I got to the Colombian capital. But in Bogota, I reunited with Danny Liska. He helped get me and the bike ready for the trip onward, and after several days, I took off down the Pan American Highway. This route follows the Pacific side of the Andes, and in some cases, it too is a dangerous road. I happened on this rock slide right after this truck had been broadsided, and there were two people still inside that truck and two survivors. From Colombia, I went on into Ecuador, and at one point beside the Pan American Highway, I saw this monument. If you understand what Ecuador means in Spanish, you know this is the point where the equator crosses the road, where you go from the northern hemisphere into the southern hemisphere. In Peru, on one of the northern deserts, I caught up with this couple riding a strange-looking motorcycle with a sidecar. I stopped because I knew that this was Richard and Mopsa English, a very delightful couple from England who were in the course of their round-the-world trip. I'd met them in Panama previously, and I was to see them again in Lima. On Easter morning, I left Lima heading south, and 82 miles beyond, the front wheel bearing on Amigo self-destructed, and these two young men are trying to flag down a truck to get me and the bike back to Lima. I had to spend 7 days back in the capital when the front wheel hub on the bike was rebuilt. Then I finally got back on the road heading south toward Chile. When you cross the border between Peru and Chile, you enter the Atacama Desert. This is one of the driest regions in the world, where in some cases they've never recorded any rainfall at all. 1,400 miles of open road with small settlements at 60 to 100 mile intervals. Funny thing about the Atacama is that you can travel just as fast as you want. There are no police, no radar guns, no speed limit, and I just wanted to see how fast Amigo could go. But unfortunately, the bike had an 85-mile-an-hour speedometer limit, and here's what happens when you exceed that limit on Amigo. Once I got to Santiago, Chile, I crossed underneath the Andes by way of a new tunnel near Argentina. And from there it was a straight shot across the Pampas to the capital of Argentina, Buenos Aires. Here I found the next break in the Pan American Highway. This is where I had to take a ferry across the Rio de la Plata to get from Argentina to Uruguay. From there, it was straight up the coast into Brazil, onto Rio de Janeiro, and then uphill to the new capital of Brazil, which is Brasilia. This is the location where none of the buildings are older than 30 years, carved out of the wilderness. But this also marked the end of the Pan American Highway in Brazil. So what I was left to do was to figure out how to get to Venezuela to pick up the Pan Am. Well, after having traversed the Darien, I figured that I would see what the interior of Brazil looked like. So I took off the road to the northwest, heading for the Amazon River. The trouble is, the closer I got to the river, the worse the roads got, because there had been some very heavy rains recently, and about 80 miles south of the river, I found the bridges were all washed out, the ferries had stopped running, so I was forced to double back to Porto Velho and there have the bike crated up, and Amigo and I flew over the Amazon in order to get to Manaus on the northern side. As we flew over the river, I could see where the rains had caused a tremendous amount of flooding. There, after landing at Manaus, I took a look at this city 1,000 miles up the Amazon from the Atlantic. The big landmark, of course, is the Opera House that was built back in the late 19th century during the rubber boom, and where opera stars from all over the world came upriver to Manaus to perform. North of the city, the road got a little bit better, the weather improved, and I found the 100 kilometers of nothing. This is a stretch of road through Indian Territory where travelers are expected to go in convoy. You were not supposed to stop and take pictures like this. They just urge you to keep on moving quickly so the Indians with their blowguns and darts wouldn't catch you. Northern Brazil has no bridges, so here I had to rely on a ferry to cross one of the tributaries, and from there got on into the border region of Venezuela. This is a typical Motel 6 in this area. I was very glad to find it and spent a very pleasant evening in a hammock under one of those thatched roof buildings. I then crossed over into Venezuela. The roads got much better. The gasoline was certainly better, and I moved on right to the capital of Venezuela, Caracas. And once I reached there, I was back on the Pan American Highway, and it was simply a matter of heading back to Bogota, Colombia. This route had been very tough on me and the bike, and quite often I had to stop to have mechanics like this make repairs to Amigo. In most cases, they were broken saddlebags or frame members, or cases where something had just simply broken and rattled off. I finally made it back to Bogota to see Danny Liska and his wife again, and then get back to Panama. By then, of course, the Darien was impassable because of the rains, so in order to get back to Panama, I had to put the motorcycle on board a cargo airplane and have it flown back. And if you can figure out where the bike is in this picture, you're pretty good, because it's in that open space in the center. They'd simply piled cardboard boxes around it, and the bike made the trip extremely well with no damage at all. From Panama, I had to head on back to the U.S., and it was a case of retracing my steps on the Inter-American Highway, as it's known in Central America. I crossed over into Costa Rica, and here I was going over the Hill of Death, which is the highest point on the entire Pan Am. 11,200 feet up into the clouds, and quite often rainy weather such as this. From there I crossed on over into Nicaragua and El Salvador and saw the results of the insurgency that was going on in El Salvador. Then I moved on to Guatemala, and here is the ancient, or the old capital of Guatemala, Antigua. It's my favorite city in all of Latin America. I've spent quite a bit of time here training Peace Corps volunteers how to ride motorcycles. And I stopped off to put on a training course there, and then headed on into Mexico. And from there, it was straight up through Central America on the original route of the Pan American Highway, which comes out at the Rio Grande at Laredo. And it's at this point that the first segment of the Pan American Highway was started and completed back in 1938. By getting back to the U.S., my trip still wasn't over, because with the inclusion of the U.S. system, the Canadian roads, and the Alaska Highway, there is as much distance on the Pan Am to the north as there is to the south. After coming back to Florida and getting geared up again, I moved on back to the main route in Texas, followed it on up to the Canadian border here at Sweetgrass, and crossed over into Alberta. From there, that takes you on up to British Columbia, to Dawson Creek, where one of the very famous segments of the Pan Am begins. This is the starting point of the Alaska Highway, which runs for about 1,800 miles up to Alaska. This Alaska Highway is a product of World War II. During the summer of '42, through a great engineering effort, there was a land route, a pioneer road, built to connect the lower 48 with Alaska, which was under attack by the Japanese at that time. It was a tough engineering job. It was a miracle that it could be done in the course of one long summer. But as you travel the road now, through the Yukon, on up into Alaska, you can see elements of the old road. It's been straightened and improved considerably over the years, and quite often you can see previous editions of the Alaska Highway as you ride in. The road is much more modern now, of course, and you've got all of the essentials that a traveler needs, such as you see here at Kluane Lake. Once you get into Alaska, the road gets much improved because it's all paved now, and the riding is very good and very scenic in Fairbanks. When I arrived here on July 4th, 1987, it marked the end of my route, my ride along the Pan American Highway. I'd covered the entire route from south to north, but the story hasn't ended there. There have been many sequels since I completed the trip. I've written a series of articles about the exploits. I've also followed up on some of the events that have occurred while I was traveling. Lauren Upton and Pat Mercier, they finally made it through the Darien Gap with their Jeep. but it took 2 more years for them to do that. The Jeep kept breaking down on the Columbia side, and they had to go back twice after the rainy season to repair the Jeep and get back on the road. They completed their journey down to South America, went by boat to South Africa, and a year and a half later wound up at the North Cape of Norway. It had taken them 14 years to complete Lauren's trip around the world. Remember the Canadian John Pitt, whose magazine article inspired me to duplicate his trip? Well, I went to Canada one summer and found John Pitt, along with the Argentine lady whom he met and married on his trip. The Alaska Highway, of course, they had the 50th anniversary 2 years ago, and they had a record number of vehicles going along the route in celebration. Richard and Mopsa English completed their around the world trip after 4.5 years. They're back in London now, where they're busy raising a family. Danny Liska is still in Bogota. He has written a book also, and he is still very much involved in the local politics because of his wife. Regina is a spiritualist, a medium, and one of the services which she performed as a spiritual advisor was to none other than Panama's General Noriega. And it was through Regina that I got that "Don't Shoot Him" letter from General Noriega that worked beautifully in Panama, but not over in Colombia. Of course, we know what has happened to Noriega. Despite Regina's advice to him to wear red underwear to avoid any unpleasant occurrences, he was wearing red underwear at the time he surrendered to the U.S. forces in the 1989 Christmas invasion. So much for Regina's advice. There have been 2 other motorcyclists go through the Darien after me. Helge Pedersen, a Norwegian, came through the year after I did, coming up from the south. He had a very difficult time, and when I met him at a motorcycle rally, he said, "Ed, if I had known what you had gone through, I would never have made my trip." I also met a Brazilian who now lives in Mexico, who came through the Darien following the same route I did in 1991. He lives in Oaxaca, and I met him in the course of one of the motorcycle tours which I have been running down south. The missionaries that helped me and Lauren Upton and Pat Mercier during our time in the Darien have not fared well. In Pucaro, the village where Lauren Upton spent so much time, 3 missionaries were captured by Colombian rebels, taken back across the border, and are still missing. After 14 months, there is no indication that the 3 missionaries are still alive, and all of the missionary outposts in Panama have been withdrawn because of this threat. For the past 5 years, I've been involved in leading other motorcyclists down south of the border as far as Panama, working with Poncho Villa Moto Tours of Texas. One of the sights that we see are the battle scenes of the U.S. invasion and General Noriega's old headquarters. I have distilled my experiences on the Pan American Highway into a book. It's been quite successful. We've completed 2 printings now, and I received a lot of good feedback on people who have appreciated getting the rest of the story. As far as me and Amigo are concerned, that 1981 motorcycle now has 256,000 miles on it. It's heading for the museum, and it's going to be retired at the same time I'm going to retire. One parting thought about the Pan American Highway in a very personal sense. Every time I ride down the road and I see these very distinctive Via Panam signs, I look at it in a different light than what you might see if you saw the same sign down on the Pan Am. To me, the Via Panam represents a slightly different meaning, and if I were to put up a sign as to what the road meant to me, here's what it would look like. Thank you very much. I hope you enjoyed the presentation in sharing with me those very memorable times riding down Destiny Road.
In 1994, Lou Gehrig's disease forced Ed to end his riding career, but not before he was awarded the BMW 500,000-mile medallion. This award, along with the AMA Most Valuable Person Award, was presented to him at Bike Week in Daytona. Ed also received the inaugural MSF Award of Excellence at the American Motorcyclists Association headquarters in Westerville, Ohio. His motorcycle, Amigo, now with 256,000 miles on it, was placed on display at the AMA Motorcycle Heritage Museum. His daughter rides Ed's 1993 R100R, dubbed Amiga, and continues the passion for travel on two wheels.